I have told this story only once before to the circuit registrar at Kethavan station because he required a formal account of the delay at kilometer 1440. I gave him the technical version. Engine seizure, atmospheric ice in the intake manifold, elapsed downtime of 41 minutes, restarted under field repair. He logged it and moved on. He did not ask who performed the repair. I did not volunteer the name. I am telling it now because Vethais, my second, asked me directly, and Vethais has never asked me anything she did not already suspect the answer to. So, here is what happened on the Sullen Corridor. The Kethavan circuit is not the longest race in the frontier territories. It is not the most dangerous, though people die in it most years, quietly, in the passes where the relay station stopped functioning 2 generations ago, and no one has seen fit to repair them. It is not prestigious in the way the Hollow Rings or the Meridian Sprint are prestigious. It is old. It predates the current registry. The Valdesi have run it since before the current registry's grandparents were born, and we have won it in 17 of the last 22 completed years, which is a statistic I mention not out of pride, but because it is relevant to understanding why my presence on the course that day was not considered unusual. I was expected to win. That is the weight a Valdesi circuit queen carries, not just expected by her court, her house, her bloodline going back 6 generations of drivers, expected by the field itself, which arranges itself around the Valdesi entry the way water arranges itself around a stone. Some drift wide to avoid the draft. Some tuck in close hopping to benefit from it. All of them know where the stone is. I do not say this with anything other than accuracy. I earned that position. I have been on the Kethavan circuit 4 times. I placed in the top 3 in each of them. I know every kilometer of that course the way I know the plains of my own hands, where the road cambers, where the ice comes early, where the altitude catches the unwary and punches the breath from them, where the switchbacks narrow to a width that separates drivers who have memorized the course from drivers who are improvising. I tell you all of this because I want you to understand what it cost me to be sitting still on kilometer 1440 with a dead engine and the field passing me. The Sullen Corridor is the second of 3 mountain legs. It begins at the Thessa waypoint, no relation to my name. The waypoint predates my family, and runs 38 kilometers to the descent ramp at Orvai Station, which hasn't functioned as a station in 40 years, but still marks the transition to the valley floor. The altitude at the corridor's peak is just under 4,000 meters. The air is thin enough that the intake systems have to work harder than they do at sea level, which means they pull in more particulates per liter, which means in cold conditions the manifold icing risk goes up. I knew this. I have always known this. I ran a pre-race check on the intake at Thessa waypoint. It was clear. What I did not know, because no one knew, was that a weather system had moved through the upper corridor 4 hours before race day, depositing a layer of supercooled mist across the switchback sections at altitude, not visible from the waypoint, not on the weather reports, which are 3 days old by the time they reach frontier circuits of this category. By the time the field reached the altitude zone, the mist had partially sublimated, but the residue clung to the inner faces of rock cuts and the undersides of overhangs, and when a vehicle passed at speed, the air displacement disturbed it. The first 24 vehicles through the zone encountered only trace amounts. The cumulative disturbance built as the field moved through. I was running in 5th position at kilometer 1440. This is not a position I am accustomed to. I had been managing a fuel pressure irregularity since the valley floor, which required me to run a slightly conservative line through the early switchbacks, which meant I was holding 5th rather than 2nd or 3rd, which I had calculated as acceptable given the profile of the back half of the course. My plan was sound. My read on the corridor was correct in every respect, except the one that mattered. The intake ceased at 11:47 in the morning local time. It did not fail gradually. It ceased. One moment the engine was pulling normally, slightly loud as it always is in thin air, the particular pitch I know the way I know my own pulse. The next moment it was not pulling at all. I had perhaps 3 seconds of coasting momentum before the grade began slowing me, and I used those 3 seconds to steer to the inside of the switchback, away from the outer edge, where the drop was something I did not want to contemplate. And I brought the vehicle to a stop against the rock face with a gentleness I am genuinely proud of given the circumstances. Then I sat in the silence and did what I imagine any queen does when she has just lost her engine on a 40-year-old circuit in the mountains of a frontier world, with no functioning relay stations within 20 kilometers. I assessed the intake manifold. I could see the problem from the driver's cabin without even opening the hood. The ice had come in as a fine mist and condensed on the warm manifold surfaces, and the engine's sudden acceleration through the altitude zone had drawn it in fast enough to overwhelm the heated intake elements. Standard procedure: wait for the engine block to cool to ambient, allow the ice to sublimate, attempt restart. Elapsed time: 25 minutes minimum, 45 maximum. Restart probability: approximately 73%, assuming no secondary damage from the seizure event itself. 25 to 45 minutes on the sullen corridor. I opened the emergency channel on the vehicle's communicator. I was not surprised when it returned only static. The relay stations have been dark for 2 generations. I was not panicked. I want to be clear about that. I was a queen sitting alone on a mountain with a dead engine, and I was not panicked. I have my mother's composure, and my mother had her grandmother's, and that grandmother survived 3 wars and a succession crisis, and was noted by every historical account as a woman who never raised her voice in an emergency. I am her descendant in that, at least. I was, however, cold. The corridor's ambient temperature at that altitude and that hour is approximately -6, and I had not dressed for standing outside because I had not planned to be standing outside. I was dressed for driving. There is a difference. I got out of the vehicle and stood in the road for a few minutes, partly to inspect the engine more closely, partly because remaining in the cabin felt like a kind of hiding, and the cold came in through my driving jacket immediately, efficiently, the way mountain cold always does. It does not creep, it arrives. The rock face beside me was wet with the residue of the same mist that had killed my engine. It caught the pale noon light and gleamed in a way that would have been beautiful under other circumstances. The road surface was bare and dry. This stretch ran along the inside of a long arc, sheltered from the prevailing wind, and in the distance ahead of me the road curved out of sight around the next switchback, dropping eventually toward Orvi Station, toward the valley floor, toward the finish line that was currently 47 minutes away and receding. I folded my arms and I waited. I do not fidget. Fidgeting is a form of protest against circumstances that are not going to change because you are unhappy about them. I waited with the patience that is either my greatest virtue or my most self-punishing habit, depending on who you ask. I watched the field go by. The first vehicle came through approximately 90 seconds after I stopped. It was one of the Odyssey entries, bright orange, the paint scheme unmistakable, moving fast through the switchback with the particular confidence of a driver who knows the line. The driver saw me. I know because the vehicle's speed dropped by perhaps 15% for approximately 4 seconds, which is consistent with a driver assessing a stopped vehicle and calculating whether to stop. I watched the calculation happen in real time, visible in the slight variance in the vehicle's speed and the way it held the center of the road rather than its usual line. The 4 seconds ended. The speed came back up. The orange paint disappeared around the next curve. I noted this. I did not feel anything particular about it. The Odyssey are competitors. The Kethavan circuit has no rule requiring drivers to render assistance. The race had been running for 11 hours at that point. An Odyssey driver who stopped for a Valdesi entry would lose time. possibly significant time, and would receive nothing for it except the knowledge that he had done it. I understood the calculation. I would have been surprised if he had stopped. The second vehicle passed in much the same manner. Third, fourth. The fourth driver actually accelerated when he came around the bend and saw me, which I found mildly interesting as a data point on the psychology of competitive driving. There are apparently two instinctive responses to seeing a stopped competitor. You either feel the pull toward assistance, or you feel the opening like a gap in a defense, and your foot goes down. In this field on this day, the gap in a defense response was dominant. This was not a surprise. I would have been surprised by a surprise. The fifth and sixth vehicles were running together, two of the Meridian entries who had been drafting off each other since the valley floor. They passed without reducing speed at all. Either they did not see me, possible if their attention was on the draft, or they saw me and made the calculation so quickly that it did not register as a decision. Automatic. The way breathing is automatic. By the eighth vehicle I had begun to do something I did not immediately recognize as what it was. I was counting, as I always count, tracking the field. But I was also watching faces. Through windscreens, through the half-second of eye contact that was possible as vehicles came around the switchback and saw me, I was watching each driver look at me and look away. The glance that said, "That's a stopped vehicle. That's a Valdesi entry." The cold math of competition, arriving and departing in a moment. By the 12th vehicle I had begun to notice something that troubled me and that I did not immediately want to name. Every driver saw me. Not all of them slowed, but all of them saw me. I could tell by the line adjustment, the small variance in course that says a driver's eyes have moved and processed something. They saw a stopped vehicle, a figure on the road. They made a calculation that took perhaps 2 seconds and produced the same answer every time. I have spent my entire life having my rank recognized in every room I enter, every course I run, every negotiation I conduct. Recognition is the texture of my existence. People see the Valdesi livery on my vehicle and they know what it means, and they arrange themselves accordingly, deferentially, competitively, cautiously, but always in response to a known quantity. I have never lacked for acknowledgement. I have sometimes found it exhausting in its constancy, the way a familiar room can feel airless if you have never been outside of it. What I was watching on the sullen corridor was something different, not the acknowledgement of rank, the acknowledgement or its absence of the person underneath the rank. A driver sitting on a mountain in -6-degree air with a dead engine and nothing to offer. No livery visible from a windscreen. No advantage to be derived. No circuit standing to invoke. Just a person in a difficult situation who could use help, and the calculation being made about whether to give it. The calculation kept coming up the same way. I had not previously understood how different those two things were until I was sitting in the second one and watching the answer arrive with the regularity of the field itself. Acknowledged always. Seen not once. I was at the 23rd vehicle when I understood that I had never expected anyone to stop, not just on this road on this day. In general, I had arranged my understanding of the world so thoroughly around rank acknowledgement that the other kind, the simple recognition of a person in a difficult situation, the willingness to stop because stopping was the decent thing, and not because stopping benefited you, had become a category I had stopped expecting. You do not miss what you do not know to look for. I had not known to look for it, and sitting on that running board in the cold, watching vehicle after vehicle make the correct competitive calculation and drive on, I found that I was recognizing its absence with a clarity I had not had before, which meant I had felt it before without having words for it, which meant I had been missing it for a long time without knowing what I was missing. This is not a comfortable thing to realize about yourself on a mountain road, in a race you were expected to win. By my count, 31 vehicles had passed by the time I reached the 18-minute mark of my wait. 31 sets of eyes that saw me and drove on. I had a repair window of approximately 27 more minutes before the intake would be clear enough to attempt a restart. If the restart failed, I was looking at a possible overnight situation on the corridor, which was manageable but unpleasant, and which would require the circuit emergency protocol to activate, which would mean my court would know I was stranded before I finished the race, which was an image I did not particularly want to offer them. I was working through this arithmetic, sitting on the running board of my vehicle with my arms folded against the cold, when the 30-second vehicle came around the upper switchback. I noticed it because it was moving more slowly than the others. Not cautiously slowly. The corridor is not a place where caution looks that way. Caution at altitude is its own particular aggressive precision, not a reduction in pace so much as a sharpening of it. This was different. The deliberate pace of a driver who was managing something. Fuel pressure, I thought, or a temperature warning, or a tire wearing unevenly on the outside edge. All of these produce the same slightly held-back cadence, that careful quality of managing a problem without acknowledging it to the field. The vehicle was not a make I recognized immediately. Not Oracy, not Meridian, not Valdesi. The paint was a dark gray with a single diagonal stripe of pale blue across the hood, the kind of marking that suggests a private entry rather than a house team. The chassis was older, not antique, not inadequate, but the previous generation of engineering rather than the current one, the kind of vehicle you run when you set it up yourself because you know it better than anything newer. It moved through the switchback with better line discipline than most of the factory entries I had watched pass, a clean relationship between the driver's input and the vehicle's response. But it was visibly working harder than a newer machine would have to work at this altitude. The engine note carried a characteristic effort, that particular extra note that means everything is functioning correctly but nothing is in reserve. It slowed when it saw me, not the 15% assessment drop I had seen from the Oracy driver, a genuine reduction down to perhaps 30 kilometers per hour, which on this course is essentially crawling. I watched it through my side glass. The driver was looking at my vehicle, at me sitting on the running board, at the hood which I had propped open to encourage airflow across the manifold. I thought, here is another driver calculating. I waited for the speed to come back up. It did not come back up. The vehicle pulled to the inside of the road, approximately 6 meters behind mine, and stopped. The engine note changed to idle, settled, held. I stood. I will be honest, I stood because I was surprised, and surprise in a queen tends to manifest as formality, as straightening, as the automatic assumption of the posture that says I am in command of this situation even when I am emphatically not. I stood and I watched the driver's door open. He was human. That was the first thing I registered, because it is always the first thing I register when I encounter a human, not out of prejudice but out of the same automatic categorization that a pilot applies to terrain. I am noting what I am working with. He was human, male, somewhere in his middle years, with the particular build of someone who has spent a significant portion of his life in vehicle cabins and doing physical work outside of them in roughly equal measure. Not large. Not slight. Weathered in the specific way that distinguishes a person who has worked outdoors in difficult conditions from a person who merely looks outdoors in difficult conditions. Weathered as a texture, not an age. His jacket was the kind that had been good once and had been repaired several times since. Not patched for display, repaired to function. He did not look like a man who had won anything recently. He looked like a man who was going to finish the race regardless. He walked to the front of my vehicle without hurrying. He looked at the hood, looked at the engine, looked at the intake manifold with the focused attention of someone reading a familiar situation, and then he looked at me. He said, "Manifold ice." I said, "Yes." He said, "How long has it been sitting?" I told him 18 minutes. He nodded as if this confirmed something he had already suspected, not a performance of confirmation, the genuine thing. He said, "You've got another 10, maybe 12 minutes before it's clear enough to try. You want me to pull the intake cover and check for secondary ice in the plenum. I've got a heat wand in my kit." I looked at him for a moment. I was trying to determine what he wanted. In my experience, when a person offers something unexpected and costly, there is always a reason that explains the offer, and the reason is usually visible if you look carefully enough. I looked carefully. I found nothing except a man standing in -6-degree air on a mountain road, hands loose at his sides, waiting for an answer. No calculation visible in his face. No assessment of what my answer would be worth to him. Just a question, and the patience to wait for the response to it. I said, "You'll lose your position." He said, "I'm in 23rd. I'm not winning anything today regardless." He said it without bitterness, simply as a fact established and accepted. "And you're a driver sitting on a mountain. That's the situation." That is the sentence that I have returned to most often in the month since. You're a driver sitting on a mountain. That's the situation. Not, you are the Valdesi circuit queen, and if I help you I may benefit from your gratitude later. Not, you are a notable competitor and this is a public relations opportunity for a private entry driver trying to build a reputation in the field. Not even, you are a person in distress and my ethics require me to assist. Those would all have been legible reasons. I could have worked with them. What I could not immediately work with was the plainness of it, the complete absence of calculation. Here is a driver, here is a mountain, those are the facts. What else would I do? I said, "Yes, check the plenum." He went back to his vehicle and returned with a tool kit that had been assembled over a long period by someone who repaired things rather than replaced them. Every piece of it was evidence of use and attention. The heat wand was a professional model, which surprised me slightly given the rest of the kit, not the newest version, but the generation that had been the standard for serious field repair work and was still, by most assessments, the better tool. He removed the intake cover with the efficiency of someone who had done this particular operation enough times to stop narrating it to himself. He worked the wand into the plenum with the particular care that you only develop through repetition and mistakes, the confident caution that is the opposite of both timidity and recklessness. He did not talk while he worked. I found this notable. In my experience, humans in uncomfortable situations tend to fill silence with words. They explain what they are doing, offer reassurances, make small jokes. He did not. He worked. The only sounds were the wind off the rock face above us, the faint low whistle of altitude through the cuts in the road, and the occasional metallic tap of the wand against the plenum housing. I stood beside him and watched. Not because I was supervising. I know enough about this kind of repair to have supervised it, but he did not need supervision. Because I did not know what else to do with myself. Because there was a human being doing something useful on my behalf in the cold, and the correct response to that seemed to be to stay near it rather than retreat to the cabin and pretend to review instruments. The cold settled around us. The road was still and empty for several minutes. There had been a gap in the field. The rear half of the pack was spread across the valley below. The light was pale and even winter light at altitude, the kind that makes everything look slightly more real than it usually does, all the surfaces clear-edged and specific. The gray of the rock face, the darker gray of the road, the pale blue stripe on his vehicle, catching the light in a way that made it look almost luminous. Somewhere up the pass, a bird was calling in the rock cuts, the kind of sound that only becomes audible when engines stop, when the ordinary noise of a race day drops away and the mountain asserts itself. I had raced this course 4 times, and I had never heard a bird before. He worked steadily. No wasted motion. The heat wand moved with the patience of someone who understood that the job required a specific duration, and that rushing it produced the same result as not doing it at all, not the result you wanted. I found myself watching his hands, not with any particular thought, but the way you watch competent hands when you have stopped having anything else to do. They were capable hands. Scarred across the knuckles in the way hands are scarred when they have been repaired and healed and used again many times. Working hands, not the hands of someone who managed work from a distance. At one point he said, without looking up, "Your intake heating elements are running a little slow. Resistance buildup maybe. I can feel it in how the ice formed, the distribution pattern. You'll want to get that checked before the next mountain leg. I said, I have the same thought. He said, there's a service bay at Orvi Station. I know it's supposed to be decommissioned, but there's a mechanic there named Pella who maintains it out of habit. She's good. Better than good, actually. She knows this course's failure patterns the way a doctor knows common illnesses. I filed this. It was practical information offered practically with no subtext that I could detect. I said, thank you. He said, don't thank me yet. Let's see if it starts. He replaced the intake cover. He packed his tools back into his kit with the same unhurried care, checking each piece, making sure nothing had been set down in haste and left on the road. He looked at the engine one more time, checked something I could not identify by touch along the manifold housing. A small motion, 3 fingers pressed flat against the metal surface, reading temperature the way experienced people read objects they know well. Then he straightened up and stepped back. He said, give it a minute, then try. I gave it a minute. I watched the seconds on my dash. I watched the road. I watched him, standing in the road with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the rock face above us with the comfortable patience of someone who has waited in worse places for worse outcomes. Then I tried. The engine caught on the second attempt. It ran rough for approximately 15 seconds, which is normal for a cold start after a seizure event, and then it smoothed out into the tone I know, that particular voice, the one that tells me everything is in order. I exhaled. I did not realize until that moment that I had been holding my breath. Not out of anxiety, I think. Something closer to hope, which I had not expected to be feeling and which embarrassed me slightly. I looked at him through the windscreen. He was already walking back to his vehicle. I got out. I said, wait. He stopped and turned around. I said, I don't know your name. He said, Mace Greel, private entry out of the Caravel Depot. I said, Thesavane Koru. He looked at me for a moment. Something moved in his face, not recognition of the name, I think. He did not know the name, which was itself information. He had stopped for a driver he did not recognize, which confirmed what I had already suspected about his reasons. What moved in his face was recognition of the way I said it. The way a person says a name when the name carries weight. He said, after a moment, are you going to be all right on the rest of the corridor? I said, yes. He said, good, then you should go. You've still got time to make something of this. He said it the way he had said everything else. As a plain fact, you have time, go use it. Not, I gave you this so now I expect something. Not even, good luck, which would have been gracious and therefore transactional in its own quiet way. Just, you have time. The situation is what it is. Make use of it. I got back into my vehicle. I sat there for one more second than I needed to, and in that second I was doing something I will admit is not typical of me. I was trying to understand what had just happened. Then I drove. The Sullen Corridor is 38 kilometers. I drove the remaining 19 in a way I have not driven a mountain leg before or since. Not because I was reckless. I am never reckless. That is not what I mean. Because I drove it the way you drive something when you are suddenly, unexpectedly grateful to be driving it. There is a quality to that kind of driving that is different from competitive driving or training driving or demonstrating skill driving. It is very clean. You are not trying to prove anything to anyone. You are simply moving through the world with everything you have, and the world is cooperating, and that is enough. I stopped at Orvi Station long enough to find Pella, who was exactly as described, and who fixed the heating element resistance issue in 11 minutes while eating a sandwich, and I descended the ramp 47 minutes behind the leading vehicle and 39 minutes behind where I would have been without the delay. I was running in 21st position. I had 19 kilometers of valley floor and one final descent to make up whatever I could. I made up 14 positions. I finished 7th. For a Valdesi entry, 7th in the Kethavan circuit is not a result that generates celebration. It generates the particular polite silence of people who are trying to decide how to frame a disappointment without adding to it. My court was assembled at the finish line, as they always are, Vethais at the front, Orin and Deveth behind her, the rest in the configuration that protocol requires. They saw me come across the line in 7th. They saw me park. They saw me get out of my vehicle. They understood the gap between 7th and what was expected, and they were managing it the way my court manages most things, with discretion and careful attention to my expression. They were still performing the calibration, how to present 7th as something other than what it was, when the 33rd vehicle came across the line. I was watching. I had been watching since I came in, because I knew who was still out there, and I had done the arithmetic, and I knew that a driver who had spent 41 minutes repairing a stranger's engine on the sullen corridor was going to finish somewhere between 30th and 40th. I knew what that cost. I understood the size of it with the precision of someone who calculates positions and times the way other people calculate currency. Mace Greel's vehicle crossed in 32nd position. He had, I later confirmed from the circuit data, been running in 18th when he stopped for me. He finished in 32nd. He gave up 14 positions to fix my engine on a mountain road in -6-degree air with no obligation and no audience, and no one from any house team watching to note it. He pulled up to the vehicle park and got out. He did not look in my direction. He was moving with the careful deliberateness of someone who is tired and cold and not particularly interested in anyone's attention. He went to the back of his vehicle and began removing his kit. I walked over. Vethais noticed. Of course Vethais noticed. Vethais notices everything. It is what I keep her for. I saw her expression shift through 3 stages in approximately 2 seconds. Surprise at the direction I was walking, calculation about what it meant, and then the particular careful neutrality of a second who has decided to wait and see rather than intervene. She is very good at that neutrality. It is one of her most valuable qualities. The others notice too. They are trained to watch me. When their queen walks somewhere with purpose, they follow with their eyes and then with their attention, and then with the quiet rearrangement of their positions that prepares them to respond to whatever the queen does next. I was aware of this. I chose not to be interested in it. I walked to Mace Greel's vehicle and I stopped approximately 2 meters from him. He had not yet seen me. He was working through his kit, taking inventory, noting what needed to be replaced or recharged. I said, "You finished 32nd. He looked up. He registered that I was there, registered it without surprise, which told me he had a particular quality of composure that I was beginning to recognize as habitual rather than performed, and said, "Yes." I said, "You were in 18th when you stopped." He said, "Roughly, yes." I said, "You lost 14 positions." He said, "The math isn't complicated." I said, "I want to know why you stopped, the real reason." He looked at me, not the way people look at me when they are deciding how to manage me, which is a look I know the shape of from long practice. The way a person looks at a question that they are actually thinking about, the look of engagement rather than management. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I drove past you first. I saw you sitting on the running board and I went around the switchback. I got maybe 400 meters past the turn and I thought, there's a driver sitting on a mountain and it's -6 and she's going to be there for 40 minutes and I have a heat wand." He paused, as if checking the account of it against his actual memory, making sure the version was accurate. And then I couldn't think of any reason not to go back. A pause. "I didn't know who you were. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't calculating anything." I said, "I know." He nodded. He seemed to consider this settled and returned to his inventory. I said, "My name is Thesavein Koru of the Valdisi line. I am the circuit queen of the Kethavan running. My family has held that designation for 6 consecutive generations." He stopped working. He looked at me again. The same quality of attention, not the sudden realignment I was accustomed to seeing in people when they understood who they were talking to, that visible recalibration of posture and register and tone that I have watched happen my entire life. Something quieter. He was processing the information without rearranging his posture to accommodate it, which was in itself unusual enough to note. He said, after a moment, "You didn't mention that on the mountain." I said, "No." He said, "Would it have changed anything if I had known?" I thought about this. I said, "No, but I wanted you to know now." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "All right," as if knowing was a thing that could simply be accepted and set in its proper place. As if a queen telling a private driver her full title and lineage in a vehicle park was a thing that had weight, received it, and did not require him to become a different person because of it. In the days after the Kethavan circuit, I made inquiries about Mace Greel. Not through official channels. I have people who handle official inquiries, and the kind of report they produce is thorough and factual, and tells you everything except what you actually want to know. I asked through the circuit community, which is its own particular information network, full of people who know things about drivers that never appear in any registry. What I learned, he had been driving privately for 11 years, out of the Caravel depot on the frontier edge of the transit corridor. He had completed the Kethavan circuit twice before, finishing in the mid-20s both times. He was known in the community as a driver who was technically sound, strategically intelligent, and underfunded in the way that privately funded drivers who refuse to take house sponsorship are always underfunded. He repaired his own vehicle. He set up his own strategy. He had declined offers from 3 house teams over the years, which in the community was interpreted as either extreme confidence or extreme stubbornness, and there was a mild ongoing disagreement about which. The people who said confidence pointed to his line discipline and his consistent finishing record. The people who said stubbornness pointed to his finishing record being consistently good but not exceptional, and the argument that he would have won things by now with proper backing. He had a reputation for something specific, which multiple sources mentioned independently and which I therefore weighed accordingly. When things go wrong on a course, mechanical failures, accidents, drivers stranded or in distress, Mace Greel stops. He has stopped 4 times in 11 years of circuit racing. He has never been asked to stop, never been on a team that required it, never been in a position where stopping improved his own result. He does not appear to stop because he is calculating the reputational benefit of stopping. He stops because there is a driver on a mountain and he has a heat wand, and there is no good reason not to. I sat with this information for a long time. I had a decision to make, and it was not the decision that Vethais and Orin and Deveth assumed I was making. They assumed, because this is the Valdesi way, and because I had been raised in it and had never given them reason to think otherwise, that the question was whether to honor the assistance with the appropriate formal recognition, a debt acknowledged and discharged according to the hierarchy of obligation. That is a clean process. It has a protocol. The Valdesi have managed exactly this kind of transaction for generations. A deed is done. A deed is recognized. The recognition is proportionate to the deed and the standing of the parties. The obligation is discharged, and both parties return to their respective positions in the order of things. That is not what I was deciding. I was deciding whether to be someone other than the person I had been before the sullen corridor. I will not romanticize this. I am a queen. I have responsibilities that are real and consequential and do not bend to personal feeling. The Valdesi line is 6 generations of circuit tracing history and political relationships and obligations that extend outward in every direction from the person at the center. I did not walk away from any of that. I am not built to walk away from it, and I do not think I would want to be. The line is not a cage. It is what I am made of. But I also know that I spent 31 vehicles worth of time sitting on a mountain, cold, in the middle of a race I was expected to win. And in all of that time, watching each windscreen, each set of eyes that assessed and drove on, I had not once thought, someone will turn around. The thought did not occur to me. It was outside the category of likely things. I had arranged my understanding of the world around the assumption that I am seen in certain ways and not others. Acknowledged, managed, competed with, deferred to, accommodated. not simply seen, as a driver with a dead engine, as someone worth the cost of turning around on a mountain road for no reason except that there was a person and there was a problem and the cost was acceptable. I had not known that this was what I was missing until I had it. I reached out through the circuit registry and sent a message to the Caravel Depot, short. No titles because I was not writing as the circuit queen. No Valdesi formality because this was not a formal matter. The message said, "There is a race in the spring. The Aldevan Coastal, 400 kilometers, 2 mountain legs and a long valley floor. I will be entering. I would like to know if you are entering also." He replied 6 days later. The reply said, "I was planning on it." I replied, "Good." That was the beginning of what Vethais now refers to as the situation, by which she means the ongoing and increasingly visible circumstance of the Valdesi circuit queen spending time with a privately funded human driver from the frontier edge. She is not wrong that it is a situation. The Valdesi court has opinions. The circuit community has opinions. The hierarchy of both has made itself felt in various ways, ranging from the direct to the merely atmospheric. Orin has voiced concerns through the appropriate channels, which I appreciate because Orin is the kind of advisor who voices concerns through appropriate channels rather than through the gossip network. And whatever my answer to the concern, I respect the form. Deveth has said nothing, which tells me Deveth has already arrived at an opinion and is waiting to see if I arrive at the same one before saying it aloud. I find that I am not troubled by this in the way I expected to be. I expected to feel the pull of those opinions as a weight, the way I have always felt the weight of my position. Instead, I feel something more like clarity. When you have sat on a mountain and watched 31 vehicles pass without stopping, and then watched one turn around, you develop a very clean sense of what matters and what is an opinion about what should matter. Those are different categories. The Aldevan Coastal ran in early spring. 400 kilometers of coast road and mountain and valley floor, notorious for its final descent, which is 32 switchbacks in 12 kilometers and has ended more than a few promising race seasons. I finished second. My intake heating elements had been serviced before the race. I did not have any problems in the mountain legs. I ran clean and fast, and with the particular quality of attention I have had in races since the Kethavan circuit, that cleanness of purpose that comes from driving something you are grateful to be driving, something you know you could have lost and did not. Mace Greel finished 11th. In the vehicle park at Aldevan, my court was assembled in the proper configuration. Vethais at the front, Orin and Deveth behind, the rest according to protocol. Second place in the Aldevan Coastal is a good result, and there was genuine warmth in their acknowledgement, the particular warmth that comes when a result is both good and an answer to something that needed answering. When Mace came in, I watched him park. I watched him begin his post-race checks with the same unhurried care I had seen on the sullen corridor. And then I walked over, because the alternative was not walking over, and I had tried not walking over as a position, and it was not honest. He saw me coming, he straightened, he said, "Second, you had a good race." I said, "You were 14th at the Vethais Pass. You moved up 3 positions on the descent." He said, "It's a good descent if you know the line." I said, "Yes." We stood for a moment in the particular silence of 2 people who have said the practical things and are deciding whether to say the other things. The day was clear and cool, the coastal light bright on the vehicle park, the sound of the finish line crowd still audible from 200 meters away. I said, "There is a ceremony tonight. The Aldevan post-race, the traditional one. The Valdesi table is the largest. There is a standing custom that the circuit queen invites one guest at her own discretion." I paused. I have not used that custom in 4 years of Aldevan races. He looked at me, the same quality of attention, processing, not performing. He said, "Are you inviting me?" I said, "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "All right," And then, after a moment, as if it had just occurred to him that there might be a practical consideration he had missed, "Should I bring anything?" I looked at him. I said, "Just come." He nodded and turned back to his vehicle. What happened at the ceremony is a longer story and not strictly part of this account. I will say only that my court managed it with the various degrees of grace that individuals possess, and that the individual degrees were informative in ways I had not anticipated. Vethis managed it with the precision of someone who had already made her peace with what she was witnessing, and was now focused on managing the room rather than her own response. Orin managed it adequately. One member of my court did not manage it, which told me something I had suspected and had not previously had cause to confirm, and that member is no longer part of my court. The process of removing him was unpleasant in the way that necessary things sometimes are, and I do not regret it. I will say also that at one point during the ceremony, Deveth's youngest, who is 9 years old and has my grandmother's directness without yet having acquired the discretion that usually accompanies it in adults, looked across the table at Mace Greel and said, in the carrying voice of someone who has not yet learned to modulate for public settings, "You're the one who fixed the Queen's engine on the mountain." The table went quiet. Mace looked at the child with the same attention he gave to everything level, present, unperformed, and said, "The engine mostly fixed itself. I just helped it along." The child considered this with the focused seriousness of someone who was genuinely evaluating the claim. Then she said, "She says you turned your car around." Mace said, "There was a driver on a mountain. That seemed like reason enough." The child looked at him for another moment, then looked satisfied with the answer and returned to her food. The table, after a beat, resumed its various conversations. The quiet closed behind the exchange the way water closes behind a stone. I did not look at Mace. I was looking at the middle distance in the specific way that allows a queen to manage her expression in public, but I was listening to everything. I was listening in particular to the fact that he had said it the same way on the mountain. There was a driver on a mountain. That seemed like reason enough. No embellishment, no performance of modesty. The same account, given to a 9-year-old at a formal dinner as to a stranded driver in the road. Which meant it was not an account he was managing. It was simply the truth as he understood it. After the ceremony, in the courtyard outside the hall, when the night air was cool, and the coast wind was coming in from the south and most of the field had dispersed to their lodgings, Mace Greel and I stood in the way that two people stand when neither of them is quite ready to say good night, but neither of them is quite ready to say the other thing either. He said, "Thank you for the invitation." I said, "Thank you for coming." He looked out at the dark water, visible from the courtyard as a long line of reflected light at the edge of the world. He said, "I've been thinking about the Kethavan circuit." I said, "So have I." He said, "I meant what I said in the vehicle park. I didn't know who you were when I stopped." I said, "I know." He said, "I want to be clear that it wouldn't have mattered. I would have stopped for any driver on that road. That's just true." I said, "I know that too." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, carefully, with the care of someone choosing words for accuracy rather than effect, "Does it matter that I would have stopped for anyone?" I thought about this with the seriousness it deserved. It was a genuine question, and it had a genuine answer, and I owed him the honest version. I took the time to be certain I was giving him the honest version, and not a version shaped by what I wanted the answer to be. I said, "No, it matters more." He turned and looked at me. In the coastal light, his face had the particular quality of someone who has heard something and is deciding whether they understood it correctly and whether the understanding changes anything. I let him look. I am a queen. I am not afraid of being looked at clearly. I said, "You turned around for a driver on a mountain, not for a queen, not for a lineage, not for an obligation or an opportunity. You turned around because a person needed help and you had the means to give it, and that was enough reason." I paused. That is not a smaller thing than turning around for a queen. That is the larger thing. That is the thing I did not know I had been waiting for someone to do. He held my gaze for a moment. The wind off the coast moved between us. Then he said quietly, "All right." I said, "You keep saying that." He said, "It means I heard you." I said, "I know what it means." We stood for another moment in the clear dark. The circuit world continued around us, vehicles being serviced, drivers debriefing, the vast ordinary machinery of competition doing what it always does without pause or ceremony. And in the middle of all of it, two people standing in a courtyard by the coast, having said the things they needed to say in the only way either of them knew how to say them. He said, "There's the Vedran circuit in late summer, 800 kilometers, I've never run it." I said, "I've run it twice." He said, "Is it as bad as the reputation?" I said, "It's exactly as bad. The second mountain leg will try to kill you." He said, "Good information." A pause. "I'll probably enter anyway." I said, "I assumed you would." Another pause. The coast wind came in again, cooler now, carrying the particular salt cold that belongs to this stretch of coastline at night. He said, "Thessavane." It was the first time he had used my name without the designation after it. I noticed this. I think he noticed that I noticed. I said, "Yes." He said, "Is this the kind of thing where I should ask your court's permission? I genuinely don't know how this works." I looked at him. I said, "You are asking me." He said, "I understand that. I'm asking if there are other people I should also be asking." I thought about the Valdesi protocols, the 6 generations of procedure, the hierarchy of obligation and recognition that governs every formal relationship in my line. I thought about my court. I thought about Vethais, who had watched me walk to a human driver's vehicle twice now, and who had said nothing because she is the best second I have had, and she knows the difference between a queen making a decision and a queen making a mistake, and she had apparently judged this to be the former. I said, "Vethais, you should speak to Vethais." He said, "Tomorrow." I said, "Tomorrow." He nodded. That settled nod, the one that means the thing is decided and can be set in its proper place and does not need to be revisited. Then he said, "Good night, Thessavane." I said, "Good night, Mace." He walked back into the light of the hall. I stood for a moment in the courtyard, looking at the water, at that line of light at the edge of the world. I thought about the sullen corridor, about 31 vehicles and then the 32nd, about a man working a heat wand in -6-degree air with no audience and no obligation and the simple plainness of his reason. There was a driver on a mountain. My grandmother, who survived 3 wars and a succession crisis and never raised her voice in an emergency, said once, I know this from the records, I never met her, she died before I was old enough to remember, that the measure of a person is not the grand gesture made under observation. It is the small one made when no one is watching. She was talking about a different thing in the context she said it. She was talking about governance, about the gap between what rulers do in public and what they do when the court cannot see them. But I think she would have recognized what happened on the sullen corridor. I think she would have understood exactly why I am telling this story to Vethais, who asked, rather than to the circuit registrar, who needed only the technical account. The Vedran circuit runs in late summer. It is 800 kilometers of coast road and mountain and valley floor, and the second mountain leg is as bad as I told him it is, and I expect we will both finish it, and I expect that finishing it together will feel like the thing it is. I have been a circuit queen for 9 years. I have sat in vehicles and felt the precise quality of every road I have ever run. I know the feel of pavement that wants to take the wheel from you, and pavement that runs true, and pavement that is trying to tell you something if you are quiet enough to listen. What I know now, that I did not know before the sullen corridor, is that people have the same range. Some of them drive past, some of them slow and calculate and drive past, and some of them, on a cold mountain road in -6, with nothing to gain and a good race to lose, turn a gray vehicle with a pale blue stripe around and drive back. I am the Valdesi Circuit Queen. I have won the Kethavan Circuit. I have outlasted courts that tried to manage me, rivals that tried to displace me, weather systems that tried to stop me on a mountain road. But the truest thing I can tell you is this. His name is Mace Greel. He drives a privately funded entry out of the Caravel Depot. He finished 32nd in the Kethavan Circuit because he turned around for a driver on a mountain. He heard me say the thing I needed to say. And he said, "All right. That is enough. That has always been enough. I simply did not know what enough looked like until he showed me.